Many viewers of this channel are big fans of Bordeaux and have strong opinions regarding the 1855 classification of Bordeaux. Regardless of whether you love it or hate it, it's always fun to consider what it might look like if that classification were updated. Given the fact that Bordeaux has made only 2 changes to the classification in the past 170 years, the most recent of which took place more than 50 years ago, it's extremely unlikely that Bordeaux will do any sort of formal reclassification on its own. So in this video, I'm going to do it for them. I'm going to go ahead and start with the 5th gross and then work my way down to the 1st gross. And yes, I do propose some changes to the 1st growth tier, so be sure to stick around for that. In the meantime, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, for those of you who are new to either wine or to Bordeaux, back in 1855, at the request of Napoleon III, the wines of Bordeaux were classified in advance of an exposition to be held in Paris. This was so the very best wines could be highlighted at that exposition. The classification was based largely on transaction prices for the wines over an extended period of time. Surprisingly, the classification was completed in only 2 or 3 weeks. In the 1855 classification, 61 estates were classified, all of which were located in the Medoc with the exception of 1 from Grave. As with the original classification, my reclassification also includes 61 producers and is limited to the Medoc and Grave. While some second wines are certainly high enough quality to be included in the classification, I'm not going to get into that in this video, nor am I going to include right bank wines. Before we begin, I just wanted to thank the viewer who not only gave me a nudge and encouraged me to do this video, but who also sent me his proposed reclassification. While I ultimately did the classification on my own, it was certainly interesting to see his suggestions as well. By the same token, I'm certainly very interested in what you think, so definitely let me know in the comments below if you have any thoughts regarding the original classification or my reclassification or any of the producers contained in either of them. In the original 1855 classification, there were 18 estates listed as 5th growths. In my reclassification, there are 20 of them, 8 of which were retained from the original classification. In my reclassification, 3 of the estates that were 5th growths are dropped entirely and are no longer classified. Of course, one of the primary changes, and one that I don't expect to be too controversial, is the elevation of both Lynch-Bages and Pontet-Canet, both of which are substantially underrated at the 5th growth classification level. In addition, I added 5 producers from Grave as well as Chateau Gloria, which was not yet in existence at the time of the original classification. There are also a couple producers that I elevated from 5th growth to 4th growth, and then there are some producers that I dropped from other categories, primarily from the 3rd and 4th growth tiers, although one fell all the way from 2nd growth to 5th. As with the original classification of Bordeaux, my 4th growth tier has 10 different estates listed on it, 3 of which were retained from the original classification. There was also 1 producer added from Grave and 3 elevated from 5th growth status. The remainder of the list consists of 3 producers that were dropped, 2 of which were dropped from 3rd to 4th, and 1 of which dropped all the way from 2nd to 4th. I expect the drop of Chateau Griot-La-Rose from 2nd to 4th to be one of the most controversial moves in my reclassification, particularly given the fact that I elevate most of the 4th growths from Saint-Julien from 4th growth to 3rd growth status. This is particularly interesting because I've read Robert Parker's Bordeaux book from the 1980s, and in that book he was extremely excited about Griot-La-Rose and even talked about them potentially warranting a bump from 2nd growth to 1st growth. But in my view, they just haven't really done much in the 40 years since then to even deserve staying at 2nd growth, much less getting promoted to 1st growth. For that reason, I dropped them to 4th. By the same token, I think that estates like Béchevel, Talbot, and some of the other Saint-Julien producers that were 4th growths warrant a bump up to at least 3rd growth. The 3rd growth category is quite interesting because I either agreed with it strongly or I completely disagreed with it. By this, I mean that 5 of the 14 names from the original classification of Bordeaux are kept as is in my 3rd growth category, but there's 4 or 5 producers that were removed from the classification entirely. Of course, Chateau Palmer is the strongest of the third growths in the original classification, and in my opinion is definitely deserving of an elevation. As mentioned previously, 4 of these producers dropped to either 4th growth or 5th growth status, and there's 4 from Saint Julien that were elevated from 4th growth to 3rd growth. The other change I made was to add 2 producers from Passac-Léognan to the 3rd growth tier, namely Au Bailly and Chateau Pape Clément. I considered adding Pape Clément to the 2nd growth tier, but ultimately slotted it as a 3rd growth. This is where things get extremely interesting, because in addition to revealing my 2nd growth category for the reclassification, I'm also going to briefly discuss some of the producers that I think are most deserving of a potential upgrade to 1st growth status. I know that many of you will have very strong opinions about this, and I'm happy to consider them in the comments below. But in my view, I believe that there are 5 producers that have the strongest argument for a potential upgrade to 1st growth status, namely Léoville-Lescasse, Chateau Palmer, Chateau Pichon-Comtesse, Costas d'Ornel, and La Mission Haut-Brion. I'm certainly a huge fan of all 5 of these producers, and I could absolutely make the case for any one of them, or even all of them, to be bumped up to 1st growth status. In my view, however, doubling the size of the 1st growth category from 5 to 10 would be too radical a change. So in the end, I ultimately decided to only upgrade one of these outstanding estates to 1st growth status. The original 1855 classification of Bordeaux included 15 2nd growths, but in the 1970s, Mouton was elevated to 1st growth, so there's only 14 of them now. In my reclassification, there's 13 2nd growths, 9 of which were kept as is from the original classification. In addition, there's 2 of the producers in the original classification that were 2nd growths that I proposed to drop entirely from the classification. As mentioned, I also dropped Guyot-Larose to 4th, and I'm dropping Lescaume to 5th. 3 of my 2nd growths have been elevated from lower in the classification. Specifically, both Pontet-Canet and Lynch-Bages were elevated from 5th growth all the way up to 2nd growth, and I also proposed to elevate Chateau Palmer from 3rd growth to 2nd growth. The only other 2nd growth included in my reclassification comes from Passac-Léognan, namely Smith-Lafitte. While I considered including Smith-Lafitte as a 3rd growth and was perhaps a little bit overly generous with them by including them as a 2nd, based on the strength of the last 25 years, and certainly based on what I expect going forward from this outstanding producer, I decided to include them as a 2nd growth. Before we go on to the 1st growth category, I should also mention that where you see the SS designation on my 2nd growth list, that denotes super 2nd. So in my view, 8 of the 13 2nd growths listed in my reclassification are at a level that's a little bit higher than the others, and so I consider those to be super 2nds. Before moving on to the 1st growths in my reclassification, I again just want to encourage everyone to weigh in with their thoughts in the comments below. I'm hoping that the comment section for this video will function a little bit like a message board, where people can give their views and also comment on the views of others. I expect that people will have very strong opinions and substantial disagreement about a number of the opinions both in this video and that some people express in the comments below. That's entirely normal and healthy, but there's just no need to be nasty about it, so please be courteous and respectful in the comments. As amended to include Mouton in the 1970s, there are currently 5 1st growths in the 1855 classification of Bordeaux. In addition to Mouton, there's Lafitte, Latour, Margaux, and Haut-Brion. Certainly in my view, these producers are all well deserving of their 1st growth status, and they have remained 1st growths in my reclassification. But in my view, there is one other producer that deserves to join them, namely La Mission Haut-Brion. If you'd like to know more about La Mission Haut-Brion or why I think it deserves elevation to 1st growth status, be sure to watch this video that's linked above.